the premise of all of these discussions is that somehow the world is better off when nuclear levels are lower. The nuclear levels in the hand of weapons in the hands of the United States and Russia. I mean, if you think about that, it's not. I mean, that's not obvious, right? I mean, why is the world better off if we have 1,200 weapons instead of 1,500 weapons? I mean, what difference does it make? And yet, I mean, the game starts with the assumption that that the world is better off if you're a little bit lower.
We're moving towards elimination of all.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only way to understand this is that it really doesn't matter except in the pursuit of this, idea that you're someday going to essentially uninvent nuclear weapons in the world. Which, I mean, I have really tried to give this respectful consideration and try to, I mean, I have. I mean, there are really eminent people who have signed on to this idea as a proper goal for the United States. I mean, George Shultz, who's, not at all a fool, and Henry Kissinger, a very thoughtful guy, among others, have signed on to this idea of a nuclear-free world and that it should be, out there as a strategic goal of the United States. And I've really, as I said, I've made a serious effort to try to think through, does it make sense even aspirationally to hold it out as a goal for U.S. policy? And I have to tell you, I just think it's a fraud.
Exactly.
And it just ain't gonna happen. And I know that there are people who think that even though they don't believe it's going to happen, it's useful as an aspiration because it, puts us in a good position from the point of view of, whatever you want to call it, propaganda, strategic communications in the world. I don't think that promoting a really seriously, patently fraudulent idea is good for strategic communications. I mean, I just think that, as I said, I've tried to get my mind around the merits of this idea, and I have a very hard time seeing the merits.
No, I have not tried nearly as hard as Doug has. and it is a fraud, and it's a waste of time to be investing so much effort.
Well, no. It's worth trying. Look, in order to deal with it, it's worth trying to figure out what merit the proponents see in it. But part of the idea is that reductions are inherently a good thing because they're moving you toward that goal. But if you don't buy the goal and then you look at it, you say, what difference does it make if we're at 1,500 or 1,200 or 1,000, or now they're talking about maybe 800? Well, it does have some practical effects because you can't maintain the triad at the lower levels. But why do the people who think it's a good thing think it's a good thing? Well, presumably it's because in the event of a nuclear war, there would be fewer weapons available for use. Okay, that's something, right? But we're still talking about weapons in quantities that could do the whole world an enormous amount of harm if they were all used even at the lowest levels that these people are proposing at the moment. And if the key issue is, in the event of war, how many weapons could actually be used, then this point that the United States taking weapons off of operationally deployed status means that it would take us months at a minimum to get them back into usable status is highly relevant, especially compared to the Russian position, which is we could destroy them, but if we were moving toward war or in a war, we could produce new ones, faster than you could. So that's why I come back to this essential asymmetry that if what you're really focused on is the availability of weapons for use, what we're doing is in many ways much less reversible because of the way our infrastructure is set up than what the Russians are doing. Frank Gaffney had asked me to make some comments on the talks that are underway between the United States and Russia on a follow-on to the strategic arms agreement, the START treaty. The START treaty expired a few days ago, at the beginning of December. And the Obama administration was working very hard to try to get a follow-on treaty negotiated with the Russians before the expiration. They didn't succeed, but they've said that they're going to pursue this. And Today's New York Times on the front page has a story, near arms-pact U.S. and Russians look beyond it. And what I thought I would do is just give you a few very general thoughts. And this is a subject that has a lot of intricacies in it, and we obviously can't do justice to them in a few minutes, but I'll give you a few thoughts about these negotiations and some things I think that are not generally talked about in the newspapers that are important for those of you who want to try to understand the debate and the press coverage of it. The START agreement, which is from the early 90s, limited offensive nuclear weapons, and it limited them to certain levels. When the Bush administration came in, we did a nuclear posture review and decided unilaterally that we did not need nuclear weapons even at the levels that the START agreement, which is basically a tail end of the Cold War era agreement, we didn't need nuclear weapons at the levels that the START agreement provided for. And so President Bush announced unilaterally that we would, within a certain number of years, reduce our nuclear weapons to a range of 1,700 to 2,200. And this was based on a very careful analysis to preserve a whole complex set of concerns that we had about what it is that we want nuclear weapons to do in our national security policy, providing assurance, extremely important things, war-fighting considerations, but also broader security considerations about assurance to allies, making sure that we can assure our allies of the integrity of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, because one of the main things we're worried about is the proliferation of nuclear capabilities around the world. And our concern was, if there are serious doubts about America's commitment to preserving a capable nuclear arsenal, and there are doubts about whether we really can fulfill the pledges to countries that have lived for decades under our nuclear umbrella, what we would be doing is giving an impetus to various countries. Could be Japan, could be Australia, could be lots of other very capable allied countries who, if they wanted a nuclear weapon, could have one. We wanted to make sure that they and many other countries around the world did not have an incentive to go out and develop nuclear weapons on their own, because the general view is if there are lots of states in the world with nuclear weapons, the chances of nuclear war go up a lot. The chances of the United States being involved in or damaged by nuclear weapons go up a lot. And so we took those considerations into account. The range, as I said, that President Bush announced was 17 to 2,200. The Russians then, within a few weeks, announced similar reductions, unilaterally. The Russians then pressed us for a treaty. And I helped negotiate that treaty. And we said to the Russians, we don't particularly feel any great need to have a treaty with them. But they said that they were interested in a treaty, and basically as a way of trying to improve the U.S.-Russian relationship, we said we're willing to enter into a treaty, but the treaty that we wound up entering into was simply, it was an extremely short agreement. I mean, START is about 2 inches thick. The agreement that we entered into was like 3 or 4 pages long. And what it said was, the United States takes this unilateral statement that President Bush made, and we promise the Russians that we will implement it, in return for their taking the unilateral statement that President Putin made and promising us that they will implement it. So it turned a unilateral promise into an exchange, a bilateral exchange of promises. Didn't do any harm. And now, one of the things that was very important and plays into the current negotiations between the United States and Russia is we have a completely different situation with regard to our nuclear infrastructure from the Russians. The Russians have maintained a warm production capability for nuclear warheads. And so they can produce new nuclear warheads essentially instantly. The United States, for years, has not maintained a capability to produce new nuclear warheads. And so what we said we would do with our reductions is we would take weapons off of operationally deployed status and put them in storage. The Russians said to us, that's not good enough, you should destroy them. And it makes sense for them to say that because if the standard for reductions is destruction, they can destroy weapons and produce new ones instantly. If we destroy weapons, it would literally take years before we could build the infrastructure needed to produce new weapons. And we made the point that if we take a weapon off of operationally deployed status and put it on the shelf, as it were, the amount of time required to get it off the shelf and put it back onto a weapon so that the warhead could be used is actually greater than the amount of time it would take the Russians to produce a brand new weapon to replace one that they had destroyed. Now, this is an absolutely crucial asymmetry if you're going to understand these negotiations between the United States and Russia. Today's New York Times makes the point that the negotiations, it says, would try to empty at least some vaults now storing warheads in reserve. And it doesn't explain this point that if we empty the vaults, we are years away from being able to reverse this, and the Russians are, essentially hours away from being able to reverse their reductions. And if you ever read an article on this subject that doesn't explain what I just explained to you, then it's just a misleading article, because that's the asymmetry that is driving this entire debate about weapons in storage versus reductions. The other point that I think is useful to make that rarely gets into the news stories is that the Russians are claiming that a new treaty is necessary if there are going to be further reductions in levels of armaments. And President Obama has said similar things. And President Obama even went so far as to suggest that in the absence of a new agreement with the Russians, there would be an arms race. The fact is the United States has unilaterally reduced its arsenal. And the Russians are on course to make substantial reductions in their own arsenal, whether we have an agreement with them or not, for purely, financial reasons, for reasons of the fact that they have weapons that age and have to be retired over time, and it just doesn't make any sense for Russia to spend scarce resources replacing some of those systems that have lived out their useful life. So the suggestion that we need an agreement of this kind or there will be an arms race is not correct. And in fact, much of what's being pushed is that we should be purchasing reductions from the Russians that we will get in any event, whether there's an agreement or not. Now, having said that, I would point out, I don't think it's a particularly bad thing if the United States and Russia make another agreement and even agree to reduce somewhat below the levels that the Bush administration had set back in 2001, 2002. I don't think that the numbers are enormously consequential at the margin. Where you get into a serious problem, and here I would rely on the extremely good work that the bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission that was co-chaired by former Secretaries of Defense Perry and Schlesinger, and they came out with a report in May. The very good work that they did on this subject, the point that they made is if the United States does not maintain a certain level of capability, there's a danger to our triad, which is to say the land-based, air-based, sea-based nature of our nuclear deterrent. And undermining the triad would have serious consequences for stability, for the calculations of our allies, and they basically made an argument that the triad should be preserved. If you get down to numbers low enough, it makes maintaining the triad impractical. So a degree of reductions, I think, is possible. If the reductions are too severe, they could be imprudent because it could undermine the triad. And the other thing that I think is quite important is this point about extended deterrence that I started with, that we have to recognize that that what we're talking about here has the potential not simply to raise Cold War style nightmarish scenarios about, U.S. Russian nuclear war and how that would play out, but perhaps more important and of a greater practical worry is the danger that moves by the United States that look like we're really seriously trying to lead by a zero nuclear weapons world, which is what President Obama has said he wants to do. I mean, if we take this step in a way that undermines, as I said, confidence in the U.S. nuclear guarantees to allies around the world, we might wind up accomplishing the opposite of our intended purpose. I mean, President Obama has said that what motivates him is the desire to shore up the international nonproliferation regime. And one of the most important elements of that international nonproliferation regime is the integrity of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And so we should keep that in mind, because this has the potential to do what the government all too often does, which is, as I said, to achieve the opposite of what it's aiming at. And so that's worth, I think, worrying about. The last point I'll make is a number of leading senators, and the senators are very important here because any agreement would have to be approved by the Senate for ratification. And even though the Republicans don't have the ability to do much in the Senate with only 40 votes, it only takes 34 votes to block a treaty. So the administration does have to pay attention to the Republicans on this issue. What a number of leading defense-minded senators, most of whom are Republicans, have said is that the only way they would support a new U.S.-Russian agreement in this field would be if the administration presents a proper nuclear modernization initiative, so that we build up our infrastructure, we have the capability to ensure that our nuclear weapons will remain safe and reliable for the future. And this is another crucial element of this debate. I mean, whether an agreement is a good agreement or a bad agreement hinges to a large extent on what the administration's commitment is to our nuclear infrastructure. Anyway, with that, I'll be happy to take comments or questions.